We often think of people with psychosis as different from us, as maybe dangerous, or as something that could never happen to us. However, psychosis can happen to any one of us. It's simply a malfunctioning of the brain. And it happened to me. I'm an Oxford mental health researcher turned psychologist and entrepreneur. In this video, I will tell you a little bit about my psychosis experience, and hopefully it will help some of you going through a similar experience or family members of those going through a similar experience. I also hope publishing this video will contribute to fighting some of the stigma that exists around psychosis. And so looking at psychosis, research has identified 3 stages. First of all, we have the prodromal stage. This is the stage in which the person starts to struggle in their everyday functioning, but doesn't show outright psychotic symptoms yet. Then we have, second of all, the active psychotic stage. So in this stage, person in question is really actively psychotic and kind of sees, hears, or thinks things that are not actually true and that are not based in reality. And then finally we have the third phase, which is the recovery phase. In my experience in the prodromal stage, there were lots of stressors. I had moved across the world from Australia to the UK to Oxford to pursue a postdoctoral research position. For that, for quite a long time, my PhD journey was quite stressful, given that I had twins during that time. In Oxford at a given moment, I decided to quit my postdoc just because it wasn't possible to juggle family life and a very high demanding job, even though I was very, very dedicated to that job, as well as to my family, of course. I felt in a way that was a real failure. I also felt like that's not something that's commonly done in academia, having a good postdoctoral position and then quitting. And so I felt a lot of stress and a lot of shame around that decision. Following that decision, me and my family, my husband and my 2 young children, moved back to Australia again, so yet another big move. And in that period, what I mainly noticed was that I was very low in energy. I was quite negative. I struggled to engage in my daily activities and daily responsibilities, so I would kind of spend quite a lot of time lying in bed. I would isolate a little bit from people around me, so my extended family, I became suspicious of them. And I also didn't really stay in touch with my friends as closely as I usually would. Looking back at it now, I think that was depression developing, but I didn't recognize it as such at that time, because it wasn't the case that I would be crying every day or necessarily felt very, very depressed as kind of the stereotypical description of it. It was more a very physical exhaustion, a physical tiredness. And in my mind, that exhaustion, that tiredness made sense because I was going through quite large changes in my life. Back in Australia, I worked as a researcher at the Crime and Corruption Commissions, and that played directly into my active psychotic phase later, where I was convinced that I was under investigation by the police, that they were conducting a covert operation into me, and that I had done lots of things that were absolutely terrible. At a given moment, and this happened quite rapidly, my active psychotic episode started. And what happened during that period was very confusing, very frightening to me. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I really didn't know what was going on. And my husband and those people around me, close to me, they also didn't know what was going on. So we didn't take very early action just because it was very confusing, very puzzling to us what was happening. What I noticed was that I became very down on myself, much more so than during the prodromal phase. So I thought I was an absolute failure, a horrible mom, and a terrible researcher, right? So with all of these things, very small bits and pieces of evidence that apply to everyone, I would take them out of context, blow them up enormously and take them as evidence of being a bad mom, for example. So one day I remember I opened the shoe cupboard in my apartment at that time, and I saw one of my kids' shoes that was very old, very worn, and I immediately kind of started to panic almost, because I interpreted that as me being a bad mom. If I was a better mom, she wouldn't have a very worn shoe. She wouldn't have a shoe with a hole in it. Well, actually, it's just kids, right? They unfortunately go through shoes in no time. They play, they have a good time, and shoes don't always come out on top of that. Kind of taking bits and pieces of information out of context and kind of the conclusions that I would draw based on that information, small bits of information, just didn't make sense to other people who were thinking rationally and logically, right? I was convinced that I did lots of things wrong, unintentionally, but I guess I had a very harsh view on myself as well. Then became convinced that there was an international police operation investigating me. So both the Dutch police, I'm originally from the Netherlands, and the Australian police as well as the UK police, they were investigating me in a big joint operation. When I heard a plane in the air or a helicopter, I would think like, yes, that's the police, they're shadowing me, they're following me. I remember seeing people when going for a walk with my husband outside who were wearing those new headphones, wireless headphones, right? And it was just in the time that they started to emerge in the period of 2018, 2019. And I was convinced that those were all police informants or people that the police had recruited to keep an eye on me. The police operation would convict me, that was my conviction, and I would be deported from the country. My kids would stay in Australia with my husband, and I would never be able to see them again. So very distressing, very upsetting. At a given moment, I decided in the middle of the night that I would go to the police to hand myself in. So while my husband were sleeping, I left the house, went to the police station, and I said to the police officer there, look, I think I'm a really terrible mom, I'm a terrible researcher. Can you arrest me, or what do I do now? So he checked his system and he said, look, we don't have any information on here that you're a terrible mom or that you're a terrible researcher. What do you think if I call someone to take you to the emergency department to have a mental health check? And so 2 police officers came. They took me to the nearest emergency department. And then the waiting there started, which was very traumatic as well. Hospitalized under an order and stayed in hospital for around a week. They started medication, and it was very upsetting to be in hospital to me. I still didn't know what was going on. It was a scary environment to me. And of course my husband at that time didn't know where I was, so it took quite a while and quite a bit of stress, I imagine, for him to find out that I was in hospital. It's me quite sad to think back on this period. It was a very traumatic period, I think, especially for me, but also for other people involved, for my kids, for example. Went home and started my recovery. So I took sick leave from work. I had already been on sick leave for a while, and just focused on my mental health, my physical health, things like eating healthy, things like trying to process what had happened a little bit. Some people came to visit me. My mom came to visit me from overseas. My best friend came to visit me from overseas. And it was just a period, I guess, in which I developed quite a bit of anxiety. The antipsychotic medications that I received in hospital had helped quite a bit, and I recovered really, really quite rapidly. So all the delusions, they disappeared, but they disappeared over that hospital stay, over the first few days at home, and I recovered really quickly. So overall, my immediate recovery took about maybe 2 weeks, And after those 2 weeks, I started work again. I started my usual obligations, and that went quite okay. After a while, though, I got worse again. And I will make another video about that, but the reason for that was that they put me on antipsychotic medications and basically diagnosed me with stress-induced acute psychotic episode. But it turns out after some more struggles and after some more appointments with a private psychiatrist, for example, that actually I had a major depressive episode with psychotic symptoms. And so what I actually needed, not maybe most, but what I needed were antidepressants rather than antipsychotics. It has been a bit of a windy road, but I guess one reason for me to make this video is to show you, if you're in a similar situation as me, it is possible for a lot of people to recover, right? Our views on psychosis are very negative. We mostly hear about schizophrenia, for example, where psychotic symptoms are an ongoing, albeit maybe intermittent, ongoing struggle that people have to deal with. But there are also people like me who are affected by psychotic depression or a stress-induced psychotic episode where this happens once or maybe a couple of times in our lives. But you can really recover and you can overcome psychosis, especially if you're amongst the lucky ones for which antipsychotics work quite well. Another reason for me to make this video is that there is still a lot of stigma around psychosis. And I thought long and hard about making this video because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to have my name and my face associated with psychosis, right? Questions like, will it affect me negatively in future job searches? Will it affect me negatively in making new friends? Will it influence my kids in any way when they're growing up? But I think it's really important to be honest and to be open about these mental health difficulties that we experience and that all of us can experience, and to give a face to it and to show that it's not always the worst case scenarios. Really appreciate it though if you could like this video, if it has been interesting for you, if it has taught you anything, if you're in a similar situation.